The Lewis and Clark Expedition. The morning was calm on the Missouri River. A thin mist lifted from the surface and faded into a pale sky. In the spring of 1804, men in buckskins and plain uniforms loaded barrels, crates, and bundles into 3 boats near St. Louis. They moved without hurry. Every rope was coiled, every oar checked, every bag counted. These men, chosen for strength and patience, called themselves the Corps of Discovery. Their leaders were Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark. President Thomas Jefferson had asked them to go up the Missouri River, learn about the country beyond it, build peaceful ties with the native nations they would meet, and, if possible, find a practical route to the Pacific Ocean. He asked them to observe the land with careful eyes, to write down what they saw, and to return with maps and knowledge. The task was large, but the pace would be steady. Lewis and Clark were different in style but alike in purpose. Lewis was measured and curious, happiest with a notebook in his hand and a specimen on the table. Clark was even-tempered and skilled with maps and men. He could keep a crew steady through hard weather and harder work. Together they selected blacksmiths, carpenters, hunters, and boatmen. They brought gifts for councils with native nations, scientific tools, spare parts, and paper for journals. On a May morning, oars dipped, the large keelboat leaned into the current, and 2 smaller pirogues slid alongside. The Corps pushed upstream into a country most of them had only heard described. Days soon fell into a simple rhythm. Before dawn a cook fire glowed. Coffee boiled. A sergeant called the roll. At first light the men pushed off and worked against the current. When the wind was kind they raised a sail and felt the keelboat surge. When it was not, they rowed, poled, or hauled with ropes from the bank. At noon they stopped on a sandbar or beneath cottonwoods for a plain meal, cornmeal mush, dried pork, or fish when the hooks were lucky. Evenings were for mending, for writing, and for simple talk. Someone told a joke. Someone else sharpened an axe. Then the river's steady hush returned and the camp grew quiet. The river was a road and a teacher. It showed safe channels and it reminded them that strength without patience breaks early. The crew learned to judge the color of the water and the lean of a barrier snag. They learned that a bend with willows often hid a shallow braid. They learned to listen for the deep, steady roll that meant a channel would carry them through. They also learned the river's voices, geese calling in long lines, frogs clicking in evening grass, and the sudden slap of a beaver tail at dusk. A map on paper could not teach these sounds, only the days themselves could. They met people who knew these waters well. Some meetings were short, waves and small trades at a landing. Others became formal councils. The captains wore their uniforms and presented peace medals, flags, and gifts. Through interpreters they said that the United States now claimed Louisiana and wished to live in friendship and trade. They listened in return. Elders spoke of river levels, hunting grounds, and the paths to the west. The Corps learned that respect opened more doors than any musket could. When a request was denied, they asked again more gently. When advice was offered, they wrote it down. Late summer brought long light on the high plains. The men saw buffalo in numbers that seemed to darken the hills. They watched pronghorns run far faster than any horse could catch. They found towns of prairie dogs and laughed when the small animals whistled and dove into burrows. Lewis observed everything, even trying to flush a prairie dog with water so he could send a live specimen back downstream. A returning boat carried such curiosities, along with plants, maps, and letters for President Jefferson, who valued clear notes more than grand claims. Autumn cooled the air and sharpened the river's smell. The Corps reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa in what is now North Dakota. There the Missouri bent past fields of corn, beans, and squash. Rows of earth lodges stood in neat circles, their smoke holes breathing thin plumes into the bright cold. Children ran between doorways. Dogs trotted with purpose. Traders moved with bundles on their backs. After months on shifting water, the sound of steady village life felt like a blessing. Lewis and Clark chose a site nearby and began to build winter quarters. At Fort Mandan, the men cut cottonwood logs, set palisades, and thatched roofs with prairie grass. Inside, they repaired tools and stitched new moccasins from tanned hides. Lewis worked on descriptions of animals and plants, Clark measured and drew. They traded with their neighbors for corn and information. It was here that a young Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, joined the party. She lived among the Hidatsa with her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian interpreter. The captains hired Charbonneau and asked that Sacagawea travel too. Her language would be needed when the Corps crossed into Shoshone country, and her knowledge of plants and places would be valuable. She carried her infant son, Jean-Baptiste, in a cradleboard, and moved with a quiet steadiness that settled others. Winter was deep and sometimes hard. The river froze, broke, and froze again. Wolves called across the flat at night. Auroras rippled like slow curtains over the silent fort. When wind stilled, the snap and groan of shifting ice could be heard far out on the water. The routine kept everyone steady: guard duty, hunting, mending, and writing. A man with frost-cracked hands rubbed them with grease and kept working. When fever came to a bunk, a neighbor brewed willow tea. Clark made astronomical observations and kept the men busy. Lewis wrote at a small table, his words a hedge against the forgetting that follows tired days. When the ice went out and the river opened, the Corps loaded their boats and pushed once more into the current. The country changed. Cottonwoods thinned, chalky bluffs and buttes rose in their place. The river wound through a hull of white cliffs that Clark said looked like the work of art rather than time. Bison moved like slow weather across the distance. The men fell quiet in the beauty and kept their oars even. At last they reached a great fork of the Missouri. Which branch was the true river? The wrong choice could cost weeks. The water in both forks looked much the same. The captains walked and watched. They tasted, smelled, and listened. In the end they put their faith in a sound carried by the wind, a constant, low thunder from far upstream. They chose the southern branch, the present Missouri, and after long effort came upon mist rising from the great falls. Joy filled the camp, and with it a sober knowledge. The falls were splendid, and they were a wall. The portage was long and punishing. Men built simple carriages, harnessed themselves to ropes, and pulled boats over rough ground studded with cactus. Hailstones once fell so large and hard that the crew crouched with blankets over their heads and laughed afterward at the dents in their hats. But day by day the work advanced. At last the last boat slid into quiet water above the falls and the Corps pressed on. Upstream, the river shallowed and split into braids over gravel. Even the lightest boat scraped. It was time to leave water and find horses. Sacagawea began to recognize the land of her childhood, open valleys, bold peaks, a river she remembered. Soon the Corps met a small Shoshone band. In a turn of luck that felt like providence, the band's chief was Sacagawea's brother, Kameawait. The reunion was gentle and full of tears. Through her interpreting, the captains traded for horses and a guide and learned the way over the Lemhi Pass. The crossing took all their care. The ridges were steep, the trails narrow, and early snow fell. The Corps made thin soup and chewed on old leather when game was scarce. Sacagawea walked with her baby, quiet and steady as always. Clark kept spirits up with small jokes and a purposeful stride. Lewis scouted ahead for the easiest line. At last the travelers reached the Bitterroot Valley, where the Nez Perce welcomed them, fed the hungry, and showed them how to shape dugout canoes from tall pines. Saddles and gear were cached in a cottonwood to keep them dry and safe. Water carried them again, down the Clearwater, into the Snake, and at last into the mighty Columbia. Rapids roared and folded, canoes bucked and leapt. Lewis and Clark kept the men spread between boats and shore so rescues would be swift if a canoe turned. Villages lined the banks. Racks of drying salmon clicked in the wind. The air smelled of wood smoke and fish and damp stone. The Corps traded for food and hats and woven baskets, shared small gifts and news, and learned new names for old things. Storms gathered as they neared the sea. The river's mouth threw waves into moving walls. For days the men waited under wet blankets while wind hammered the coast. Then, at last, the weather opened and the Pacific spread gray and level to the edge of sight. Clark carved a short note on a nearby tree, ocean in view. The line was plain and perfect. They built winter quarters and named the place Fort Clatsop. Rain fell often. Clothes soured and never quite dried. Sickness passed through camp and was carried out again by rest and time. Even so, the months gave gifts. The men learned new foods and ways. They made candles from whale fat traded down the shore. Lewis wrote long descriptions of plants and animals. Clark mapped the river mouth and the coast. When a decision was needed about where to settle, the captains asked every voice, including Sacagawea's. The vote was counted fairly, and the fort rose where the group agreed. In March of 1806 they began home. Upstream travel was slow. The current pressed hard, rapids demanded ropes, poles, and patience. At the Nez Perce villages the Corps retrieved their cached gear and waited for snow to soften in the high passes. While they waited, they learned more about medicines, tools, and trade paths that laced the mountains and plateaus. When spring finally opened the Lolo Trail, they crossed with fewer stumbles and better boots. Back on the east side of the mountains, near the headwaters of the Missouri, the captains decided to divide for a time to learn more ground. Clark went with a party to explore the Yellowstone River, which the map still left blank. Lewis turned north to the Marias River to see how far the northern plains might reach. The decision multiplied their knowledge and their risks. Lewis's group soon met a small party of Blackfeet youths. Tension grew in a night camp. At dawn, a struggle flared and 2 of the Blackfeet were killed, an event Lewis recorded with sorrow and gravity. He ordered a fast ride to avoid further bloodshed. The episode sat heavy on him and remains a painful page in a journey mostly carried by patience, trade, and help. The country holds the memory without haste. Clark led his party down the Yellowstone, where the river widened into shifting channels and cut sandstone into towers and caves. He found a tall, isolated rock on the plain and named it Pompey's Pillar for Sacagawea's son, whom he called Pomp. He carved his name in the stone and watched a herd of bison swim abroad, crossing with slow, powerful strokes. Wolves came bold to sniff the edge of the camp at night and stole meat when guards dozed. The men laughed and moved the meat higher. By late summer the separated parties rejoined near the mouth of the Yellowstone. The river seemed to welcome them. The current was strong and friendly, miles slid by in hours. The men sang as they stood in the boats and let the wind dry their shirts. At the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and their son said farewell. There were handshakes and quiet words of thanks. Then the Corps pushed on for the last long drift to St. Louis. They reached the town in September 1806 to cheers, cannon salutes, and handshakes that seemed to go on forever. The men were lean and sun-browned, their clothes worn, their eyes bright. In their packs were maps, notes, seeds, minerals, and stories worth more than gold to a young country that wanted to know itself. They had not found an easy water route to the Pacific, there was none to be found. But they had tied the rivers together with knowledge and with names that fit the land. The journals they carried home were rich. They recorded the grizzly bear's power and persistence, the pronghorn's astonishing speed, the coyote's quick intelligence, and the California condor's silent, circling flight. They taught readers about camas, biscuitroot, and serviceberry, about sage on the wind, about cottonwoods that whisper even in still air. They drew plains and timberlines with words anyone could follow. They wrote of salmon thick in a river and of stars seen through clear mountain air as if newly made each night. Most of all, the journals honored people met along the way. Page after page describes meals shared, lodges opened, and directions given by those who had lived for generations in the places the Corps passed through. The Mandan and Hidatsa had helped them survive their first winter. The Shoshone had traded horses at the edge of stone country. The Nez Perce had saved the men when hunger pressed hardest and had kept their cached gear safe. Chinookan-speaking traders had shown how commerce flowed in steady patterns along the great river. The expedition would not have endured without this help, and the captain said so plainly. One member deserves special mention beyond any single paragraph. Sacagawea read the land, interpreted languages, steadied worried minds, and kept moving with a child on her back. She pointed to a familiar pass and to edible roots. She traded a beaded belt for a needed horse. She stood quiet when others were loud and spoke when a clear voice was needed. Her presence signaled to wary observers that the group was not a war party. Her work was constant and without show, and its value was beyond measure. Another member, York, an enslaved man who traveled with Clark, worked, hunted, endured, and voted with the others when the captains asked for the party's judgment. He swam icy rivers, carried loads up steep banks, and met people who had never seen someone like him. Many admired his strength and calm. His story, long left in shadows, belongs in the light beside the others. When Lewis and Clark reported to President Jefferson, they brought more than curiosities. They brought a truer map, lists of nations, notes on trade, and a record of how far steady manners can carry a group through hard country. Settlers and traders would follow, and with them would come both growth and grief. Treaties would be made and broken. New towns would rise on old grounds. The expedition was not the end of anything. It was a beginning that asked later generations to act with more fairness than many achieved. Even so, the journey offers gentle lessons that do not grow old. Prepare well. Move at a pace you can keep. Listen first. Trade fairly. Make a good map for the next traveler. Share the fire. Thank those who help. Put courage and courtesy in the same pack. And when you come home, write it down so others can learn and rest easier. If you would like to walk the route once more in your mind, start at the muddy ramp near St. Louis. Hear ropes rasp on wood. Smell river mud warming in the sun. Drift past tall cottonwoods whose leaves speak quietly even on still days. Reach the villages where corn stands high and footpaths cross in steady lines. Feel sharp hail on your back as you lean against a boat carriage at the Great Falls. Cross the hard country where snow crunches underfoot even as the sun burns bright. Slide into clear water that runs between black rock walls toward a far horizon. Then turn back with the spring, climb the passes, and let your heart lift when the plains open like a book you have learned to read. Rejoin friends at a broad confluence and find that the river you fought for months now hurries you home without complaint. Watch St. Louis rise in the distance, hear the cannon, and step ashore changed. Let the story close gently. Imagine the camp at dusk. A pot simmers. A pen scratches on paper. A dog sighs and turns in the grass. The river slides by, forever moving, forever the same. Tomorrow someone will shoulder a pack, push a boat, offer a hand at a steep place, and listen for advice in a language they are just beginning to learn. This is how long journeys succeed. From 1804 to 1806, the Corps of Discovery followed water and mountain lines across a continent and back again. They traveled at the speed of rivers and the pace of trust. They learned, endured, and returned with gifts of knowledge. Their names, Lewis, Clark, Sacagawea, York, and many others, now rest like bright stones in a wide stream. The current moves on, but the stones remain, showing where the water has been and helping the next traveler find safe footing. At Fort Clatsop the days settled into a patient order. Men fetched driftwood, split kindling, and kept small fires alive to dry clothes that never quite lost the rain. Hunters went out in pairs and came back with elk that fed the camp and gave hides for fresh moccasins. Seaman, Lewis's Newfoundland dog, trotted between lodges, shook water from his coat, and lay near the warmest embers. On the worst storm days the captains read aloud, told simple stories from home, and reminded everyone that no storm lasts forever. News of their safe return spread quickly. In St. Louis the men visited the blacksmith, the barber and the baker, then slept on beds that did not sway. Letters hurried east. Mapmakers drew firm lines where blank paper had been. Families who had worried breathed easier. In Washington City, Jefferson unrolled the new maps across a table and traced the Missouri and Columbia with a fingertip, pleased not with glory but with knowledge. Think of the seasons that turned while the expedition moved, 2 springs of fresh leaves, 2 summers of heat, 2 autumns of yellow grass and cool nights, and 2 winters of learning and rest. The same river that pushed against their oars carried them home in the end. The same mountains that stopped them offered views worth the climb. The same people who first watched them as strangers said farewell as to guests who had tried to listen and learn. The land, the water, and the many nations along both held their stories carefully, the way a river holds reflections at sunset, and then let them pass on to the next bend in the long, quiet flow of time.